think every single person on this planet needs to be educated and re-educated about climate change. We are dedicated as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to embrace this education issue.
We can look into the eyes of our children, our grandchildren, and we can finally say, tell them that we have joined hands to bequeath a more habitable world.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
State Congress voted to ban abortion.
Throughout the universe located.
Global temperatures rise.
The effects on social media on Generation Z.
To avoid catastrophe, rising sea levels, and dying coral reefs, the epicenter of a global pandemic.
No exception for rape or incest.
So loads of things contribute to climate change, but if we had to name the two biggest contributors right now, they would be energy and they would be also food. About 1/3 of global warming is the result of how we grow, distribute, and dispose of food, and there are many more environmental impacts beside that. We have a pretty good idea of how to fix the energy problem, electrify everything and make clean electricity, and also use energy efficiency. But what about the food problem? To discuss that issue, please join me in welcoming three wonderful guests. To discuss this, they are Andres Mogro. Mogro. Okay. He's the program coordinator of Fundación Avina, a sustainable development foundation working all over Latin America. We've got Natalia Luglio, and she's the director of Fazenda Floresta, an ecological farm in the state of Sao Paulo. And by the magic of Zoom, we have Michael Grunwald. He's the author of We Are Eating the Earth, a best-selling book about the problems with our food systems. So, Michael, I'm going to give you the pleasure of starting first because you're farthest away. Your book really does go deep on a wide-reaching issue. For those watching, what do you mean when we say we are eating the earth?
Well, thanks so much for having me, and I apologize. I'm calling from a very depressing business park in the middle of Southwest Florida. But you know, when I say we are eating the earth, essentially I mean agriculture is eating the earth. Our cities and suburbs are now about 1% of the land on this planet. And our farms and pastures are nearly 40%. We are losing a soccer field worth of tropical forest to agriculture every 6 seconds. And so really this natural planet that we have and that we love is becoming an agricultural planet. And that has huge impacts on it's the leading driver of water pollution. It's the leading driver of water shortages. It uses 70% of our fresh water. It's the leading driver of biodiversity loss. And it's also responsible for about 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions, 1/3 of our climate problem.
So before we were doing a mining operation on planet Earth, now we're doing a farming operation on planet Earth. So yeah, okay. Many people are aware that the agriculture cuts into natural spaces, but there's also the question of chemicals. I mean, we've got fertilizers from the fossil fuel industry, we've got pesticides from the fossil fuel and chemical industries. Is that an issue too? What's the alternative?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, there are plenty of issues with our, diesel tractors and crop dusters emitting carbon dioxide, right? You've got the cows burping and farting methane that everybody laughs about, but it actually is a real problem. And as you mentioned, fertilizer and also rice fields, creating all kinds of problems. Fertilizer literally made from natural gas, from a fossil fuel. But the main climate problem with agriculture is from deforestation and wetland destruction. Trying to decarbonize the planet while continuing to tear down trees for agriculture, it's like trying to clean your house while smashing your vacuum cleaner to bits in the living room. You make a huge mess because all that carbon from the forest or the wetland goes right back into the atmosphere, but you also cripple your ability to clean up the mess because forests and wetlands currently soak up about a quarter of our carbon emissions. So it really is a land use problem as much as it is a chemical problem.
Good. Stay with us, Michael. Natalia, you're director of Fazenda. Can you tell us more what makes this project unique in the Brazilian landscapes?
So the big problem in Brazil about carbon and land usage is that we are cutting down forests so we can produce food, but we have 28 million hectares of good land where we could grow food. They're not being used. They are just divested, like they're there without any usage. So what we are doing in São Paulo, there is the Atlantic Forest, is that we are restoring this very destroyed pastures and turning these areas into a very productive plantations. So we are increasing the yield of the production, and so we don't need the same amount of land that other people usually do. So we can reduce the area where we grow food, and we grow more food using less area. So we don't have this problem of turning forests into pastures. And the thing is, when in São Paulo, that is the Atlantic Forest, we only have 12% of the native vegetation left, and we are still cutting down these areas. So we really need to hurry and start to restore this vegetation, so it doesn't end, because it's coming to an ending point. Like, we cut down mostly everything. So when I work with coffee, and coffee is one of the most one of the productions that releases more carbon in the atmosphere and uses more water. And when we grow those coffee plants in the agroforestry system, we don't need almost any water, and we can reduce the carbon emissions and have a better production, and people can make more money out of these areas without cutting any trees. So it's a big thing.
It's an agroforestry system that you're working with. So you're kind of working with nature rather than against it.
Yes.
Yes. And is it a form of regenerative agriculture? Is the soil becoming healthier because you're not using chemicals? Tell us about that bit.
Yes. One thing about agroforestry is that we follow what nature usually does. So instead of cutting down everything and putting a lot of fertilizers, pesticides, we just create a safe environment, so the plants don't need that much pesticides, and almost actually we don't use any pesticides, so it's a very good thing. You release the amount of money you spend on pesticides that usually come from Europe and other countries, and we use things we have on the farm. So the trees that we prune, we chop those pruned the wood,
Yeah.
and this turns into a fertilizer. So we
do
don't.
you make biochar, or do you make something called biochar, or?
We do.
Ah.
We use biochar. We use just regular, not burnt wood. We use the coffee.
Yes, the coffee shells.
Shells, yes.
Yeah. Okay, got you. Yeah. Okay, I understand. We'll have a little look at more dive into that. Let me bring in Andres. For those that may not be familiar, what does Fundación Avina do and how does it relate to agriculture and food?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question and for the invitation. Fundación Avina is a civil society, but also philanthropic organization working in Latin America for the last 25 years. Our objective is to take care of the planet, but with the human dignity at the center. And we have several projects ongoing in the region, one of which is related directly to agriculture called Andes Resilientes. And Andes Resilientes is currently a regional project implemented in Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, and it's supported by the Swiss cooperation and implemented by Avina and Helveta Swiss Intercooperation. And it's focused on family agriculture. And it looks at the other side of agriculture. Agriculture is also very heterogeneous in the world. It's not always the same situation. In the case of the Andes of Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, around 60 to 75% of all the produce that is generated by agriculture comes from small families where the main workforce is the family themselves with land smaller than 5 hectares, and that is suffering from different impacts of climate change, not just making them more vulnerable, but they are in the process of aging, for instance, because the parents that are working on agriculture, they don't want their children to work in agriculture because in the Andes, being a farmer means that you're poor. And it shouldn't mean that. And the average age of the farmer in the Andes is now nearly 50 years old, which means that in a few years, we're going to begin to have a problem where we might not have people to dedicate themselves to agriculture because they are vulnerable because of different externalities, one of which is climate change. So that what we're trying to do is to bring that reality onto the articulation with different levels of government in the 3 countries. So with the governments of environment, of agriculture, of social inclusion, and to make them see that the beneficiaries of the policies that they're implementing are actually the same ones. So the family agricultures farmers are the ones that the Ministry of Agriculture is working with. When the Ministry of Environment thinks of who are the most vulnerable in the agriculture sector, it's the family farmers. And when social inclusion thinks who are the poorest people in this country, it's usually the family farmers. So trying to find that articulation is something that Andes Resilientes has been trying to do for the last years.
This is very interesting. And this aging of the farming population is not just in Latin America. I mean, the chocolate, the cocoa crops in West Africa are suffering from exactly the same problem, climate change and an aging population of farmers, and nobody wants to do the job. This is a big story all on its own. Let me just go back to Michael a little bit, because I'm very conscious that you sat in a car park in southwestern Florida. My brother lives down in southwestern Florida, so I know it. I don't know your car park. What's the main message of the book? I mean, everyone seems to be gathering around regenerative agriculture, Michael. It used to be you had the big seed companies and pesticide companies with intensive agriculture. You had organic agriculture on the other side, and nobody could agree which was the better. Is there some happy balance in the middle with regenerative? Does that make sense? Or do you have a different kind of recipe for a sustainable agricultural system across the globe?
Well, in some ways, I'm agnostic to that question. I was really struck by what Natalia said about how they're making more food with less land, because that's really where I'm for high yield agriculture, and I've seen it done in an industrial way, I've seen it done in a regenerative way, and I've seen it done in a mix. But if you're making more food per acre, then you don't need as many acres to make the same amount of food. You eat less of the earth. And I think that's really important. A lot of the regenerative movement, they focus a lot on that it's maybe a little bit better for the biodiversity of the soil, or a little bit better for the biodiversity of that particular piece of land. And that's great. And I think, good soil can help us grow more food. But I think it's important to remember that agriculture, right now it uses a landmass the size of all of Asia plus all of Europe. we're looking at 12 billion acres of the planet. And, the bigger it gets, the smaller nature gets. And the real loss of biodiversity is when nature is transformed into agriculture. It's not when agriculture is transformed into more intensive agriculture. So I think in general, this idea that we need agriculture to be more productive and not more extensive, to make more food per acre and not use more acres to make food is really important. Sri Lanka, they banned agrochemicals, right? They got rid of all their pesticides, all their fertilizers, and within 6 months, their yields crashed. They had food shortages, food riots, the government fell, the president fled. It's not a really good model. So again, there are some real downsides to intensification, and we need to be mindful of them. And we want to really press our farmers, and particularly our big farmers, to make less of a mess. But we don't want to push them to make less food, because we're going to have to make more food over the next 30 years than we've made over the last 12,000.
Are we allowed to go down the rabbit hole of meat on this subject, right? Because I mean, there's
Absolutely.
a lot of land being converted to provide food for cattle, right? And I mean,
Absolutely.
I'm not saying I'm virtuous. I am a vegetarian, but I started being a vegetarian after being taken to a slaughterhouse in Nairobi, Kenya. I think if people took people on bus trips to slaughterhouses, the conversion rate might be a bit higher than having meetings about it. But yeah, the rabbit hole of meat, or is it just not worth fighting it? We can't change this
It,
overnight anyway, so whatever.
Well, I mean, it is going to be hard, but all of these things are hard. If it were easy, somebody would have fixed it already. And we can't just hand wave away the problem of meat. Right now, about 4 of every 5 acres of agriculture on this planet are supporting livestock before we eat them. Right? It's either pastures or it's growing crops that we feed to our animals. And right now, the biomass of our livestock weighs 15 times more than the biomass of wild mammals. And in the rich world, we eat 4 times as much meat as they eat in the developing world. We're on track to eat 70% more meat by 2050, and that we're on track to deforest another 2 Indias worth of land by 2050. And that just what environmentalists say about how there's no planet B. Well, if we continue on that path, we're going to need one. So we are going to have to, particularly in the rich world, we're going to have to eat less meat, and particularly less beef, because cattle uses about 10 times as much land as poultry or pork. But at the same time, we're also going to have to make meat more efficiently, because like I said, if it was only 2 times as much land instead of 10 times as much, that would make a huge difference. It's kind of like Willie Sutton said he robbed banks because that's where the money was. Well, if you're a climate hawk, if you care about emissions reductions, you have to care about beef and
Yeah.
meat generally, because that's
Got you,
where the
Michael.
emissions are.
Got you, absolutely. Natalia, I'm not going to ask you if you're a vegetarian or if you're a meat eater, but when you come to where you're operating in the Atlantic forest, do you see the pressures around you of the intensive meat industry growing food for cattle? And is this the land that you're rehabilitating, restoring, bringing back to life? Okay.
So, um, and I started working in a livestock farm, and we started the transition into agriculture because we saw that it was more profitable, and also better for the environment. And the thing with cattle farming or all the livestock industry is that we produce very little calories in these areas. We can't really feed people with beef or chicken, poultry, cheese, anything. We we need a lot of land to produce food for these animals. And I in my region, we can see this, like the soy production is coming, and we have a lot of pastries there. And these pastries are almost all the areas in my city were supposed to be protected areas for forests, and people cut it down a long time ago, and now we see animals going around all in these protected areas where water was supposed to grow from the floor, like the water. I don't know
The
how to say,
water
like,
table, the water
yeah,
underneath. Yeah.
yeah. This
Yeah.
we should have waterfalls and water coming from everywhere, and we don't have it anymore because we have all these animals going around and not allowing the water to come. So people are starting not to have water in their houses anymore. It's crazy.
Because the whole ecological balance has been
Yes.
damaged. Yeah, exactly. This requires, I mean, planning is important, but it's good what Lula has done here to actually reverse the rate of deforestation. But everybody says with the Amazon that we need to not only reverse the rate, we need to actually stop the deforestation and restore the land that has been damaged and use that for the productivity of agricultural crops. Yeah. Just coming over here, I mean, you're a different part of Latin America, but is that also a challenge, a tension between farming systems, the production of meat versus the production of, I don't know, corn or vegetables? Yeah.
I would say that in the Andes, it's not as much, but you will see livestock farming practices in family farmers because the animals are a complementary source of income, but not necessarily from the selling of meat or beef, but milk or cheese. But that does create a problem in terms of the advancing of of the land that is dedicated to pastures. So what we've seen, for instance, is we've seen instances where the livestock that is dedicated for those complementary income, like cows, are replaced with llamas because llamas have a different way of eating the pastures. They don't grab the pastures and take them out from the roots, but they cut at the.
They're more like sheep.
They're more like sheep, so they don't create that problem with water sources, for instance. So what we're doing now is in many of the instances is promoting the replacement of cows with llamas and also promoting the consumption of llama meat, for instance. But the level of agriculture that family farmers have, of livestock farming that family farmers have, is not really an industrial amount, but it's more of a complementary income, like bee, like the creation of honey, for instance. That's also a complementary activity in family farmers.
I mean, the production of food is interesting to the extent that, of course, people need food because if you don't have food, you die. But also, people need healthy food, don't they? Because if you overconsume bumper amounts of food, then maybe you get overweight. And I mean, in parts of Africa now, meat has become so readily available, the level of heart disease has gone through the roof, and diabetes, because suddenly, from being very poor people, some of the middle classes in Africa now have huge availability of food that they'd never had in generations. A bit like in Europe. I don't know if it's the same probably in the States, Michael. I'll bring you in a second. But in Europe, you know, after the war, suddenly people had access to huge quantities of food and overindulge. Now everybody's trying to lose weight rather than put on weight. I mean, these are the kinds of strange imbalances as well. So it's about health as well. I mean, do you believe that the systems you're working on in the Atlantic forest with repairing the damaged land from cattle pasture land damage are also producing food that is healthier for the people in Sao Paulo?
100% sure. Yes, because our food is more it has more nutrition because it has no pesticides or anything that um, forces it to grow. It grows by itself, like in nature, like nature works. But one thing about that is that we need to change our food system. Like people can't be forced to eat that much meat. Like in Brazil, we have a very big industry that
It's campaigning for
and
people to eat large
yes,
amounts of meat. Yeah.
and it's crazy because we are actually dying because of that. The more poor you are, the less access to vegetables you have. So people are not, they are only eating processed food and processed meat, And we are dying. Brazilians are dying because of that. Indigenous people that are not living in their communities anymore, people from favelas, we are all eating because we don't have access to real food. And all we think about eating is meat.
Michael, what about healthy food versus quantity?
Well, here I might be a little bit of a buzzkill, because I do think these healthy food issues are really important, but I think there's often they get conflated with these agricultural questions in ways that I think are not quite right. Right? That you can use a soybean and turn it into edamame, right, which is very healthy, or you can feed it to a pig and make bacon. Which is less healthy, right? The questions of our diets, it's absolutely true. We're eating too much processed crap. We're eating too much red meat. We are eating too much sugar. And those are problems, but they are somewhat separate from the problems of how we grow things, right? The problems people eat too much Doritos or they eat too many Twinkies. It's not because it was grown on an industrial farm or because it was GMO seeds that make it bad. It's just bad, right? They're Twinkies, they're Doritos. I think a lot of people, particularly in this kind of slow food, organic farming movement, tend to pretend that this idea of the eating the earth is really tied up with this idea of how we farm. But I think that's not necessarily true. I think we need to improve our diets and we need to change what we eat, but that is very little to do with how that food is grown. And the question of how food is grown, the most important question is, how many acres are we using to grow it? How many calories can we produce? And are we eating it in the form of inefficient meat or more efficient plants?
I'm going to give the last word to our friend here. So are you dealing with the aging of the farming population in those countries so that we still have small scale farmers? And is it about, do you need a huge marketing campaign to show that being a farmer is the coolest thing in the whole world? Because it actually is pretty cool.
I think we need to change the reality that being a farmer in the Andes means being poor. And that in many cases relates to just prices, for instance, or the types of produce that we want to buy. When you go to the supermarket and you look at the tomato pile, you'll grab only the perfectly round tomatoes. Nobody wants the smaller ones. Nobody wants the misshaped tomato. So many of the products that family farmers are making or in an organic way don't necessarily fit those descriptions. And most of the profits come to the middleman. So there needs to be a way to cut middlemen and to connect the final consumers with the farmers as close as possible to ensure fairer prices.
Good. We've run out of time. This is such a vast subject. There's absolutely no way that we can cover all the issues on food and farming and agriculture and health and land and emissions and climate change. But thank you for sharing your perspectives. And I think each perspective is worth hearing. And I think the audience, I think we have about 3 million viewers today around the world. So I think they will have heard some interesting points of view of which they might agree or not agree. But that's okay too. Thanks for being on We Don't Have Time and best of luck with your work.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Nana from the Youth for Climate Action Team, and I am here reporting on yesterday's most pressing negotiations and events here at COP30. First, I would like to reflect a bit more on the indigenous communities here at COP. I mean, from what we know, there are 2,500 indigenous individuals participating in COP. However, only 14% of those, so around 360 individuals, are actually accredited to the blue zone that you can see all around me, which means that only 14% of them are actually able to access negotiations and have their voices heard within these negotiation rooms. I mean, we are here in the center of the Amazon, and while it is so important to protect the Amazon forest itself, it is so utterly important to protect the people living within it. These people are losing their homes. I mean, how many more people, how many more indigenous leaders, communities have to suffer, have to die in order for us to finally hear them out and hear their voices and respect what they have to say? That is exactly what they wish for. They want to be included within these negotiations, within these debates, within these discussions. That's exactly what they're asking for. They want to be respected. We talked to an indigenous member of an indigenous community here at COP30, and here is what she had to say. Here is what she feels the indigenous communities need and how we can best support them.
O mundo precisa entender que nós, os povos indígenas, guardamos e asseguramos um conhecimento para que a gente possa frear a crise climática. Os nossos territórios são essenciais e precisam ser considerados uma política climática. A demarcação desses territórios é essencial. E é importante dizer que os nossos territórios guardam memórias e que a Amazônia não é só a copa das árvores, ela também são pessoas que vivem aqui e se conectam com ela. É importante ressaltar que estar aqui precisa reconhecer essas vidas e a nossa luta, o nosso território. E nós precisamos estar nesses espaços de tomada de decisão para também trazer um conhecimento ancestral. Nós convivemos há milênios com a natureza sem destruí-la. E nós não precisamos de uma invenção, de uma nova ideia de como frear a crise climática. Já existe uma ideia ancestral, que é se entender como parte da floresta e cuidar dela. Então, o mundo precisa entender que nós temos a tecnologia para salvar o mundo e ela não é inventada, ela está conosco há milênios e os nossos territórios também são essas tecnologias. É esse recado que nós viemos trazer para o mundo, que o nosso conhecimento é a resposta, que os nossos territórios é a resposta e isso precisa estar nesse espaço.
The indigenous communities are angry at the fossil fuel industry. I mean, of course they are. These are the industries destroying their homes, but it's not only them who are. If we look at the fossil fuel roadmap and the 80 countries wanting to implement this roadmap are angry. Why? The draft text does not reflect this roadmap whatsoever, and there's 80 countries supporting it. So what are these countries doing? They are not willing to go further with the adoption of this draft text and the legislation within it until it reflects this roadmap.
Everything is moving fast here at COP30 in this second and last week. Let's go through the latest updates of the negotiations. Ministers are already deep in consultations and new texts keep arriving on the official UNFCCC website. The key issues in the Muitirão package of the presidency are the implementation, the 9.1 article of the Paris Agreement, the climate and related trade, big uncertainty on adaptation finance. Technical work should have finished yesterday and the political work will proceed now. The EU pushes to include climate-related trade measures in the Just Transition Work Programme but faces strong resistance. The NCQG remains unclear and ministers are not ready to set a numerical target for adaptation finance. There is a chance that COP might finish on Friday.
Chuck! Oh! Julia and Lana! Hi guys! So, what's the most important thing that you've learned last week from the